wealthy businesswoman once spotted her longtime driver sleeping on the street. What happened next stunned the entire city. The exact moment it all unraveled was caught on camera during a press conference. Victoria Ashford, 52, a real estate mogul worth over $200 million, stood before investors and reporters when a CNN journalist asked a question she never expected. "Ms. Ashford, is it true you dismissed David Thompson without warning, forcing him to sleep in his car during last week's snowstorm?" The ballroom at the Ritz fell silent. For years, Victoria had carefully built a reputation as a philanthropist and champion of social justice, but now, live on national television, the mask began to slip. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, nervously adjusting her pearl necklace. In the third row, a man in his 30s sat motionless, watching her every move. His name was David Thompson. For 4 years, he had been her driver, always punctual, discreet, invisible in her world of privilege. She never imagined he had been quietly preparing for this moment. Just 3 weeks earlier, David's life had changed in a single morning. He had been late, only 15 minutes, after spending the night in the hospital with his 8-year-old daughter, who had suffered an asthma attack. When he tried to explain, Victoria cut him off without looking up from her phone. "Your personal problems don't concern me. Pack your things and leave today." It wasn't just the job she took from him. He was also forced out of the small staff apartment she controlled. And so, during one of the coldest nights of the year, David found himself with no place to go. But he didn't collapse under the weight of injustice. Something inside him hardened. He wasn't just a driver. Victoria never knew he held a degree in business or that he possessed a near photographic memory. For 4 years, he had witnessed and recorded everything, her calls, her deals, her secrets. Now, back at the press conference, the reporter pressed on. "We have evidence Mr. Thompson was left to sleep in his car after being evicted. How do you reconcile this with your public image as a defender of fairness?" Victoria tried to recover. "That is a complete misrepresentation. Mr. Thompson was dismissed for repeated violations of protocol." That was when David calmly rose to his feet. Every eye in the room turned toward him. With unsettling composure, he opened a black briefcase and lifted a stack of documents. "Ms. Ashford," his voice echoed across the hall, "are you sure you want to continue with this story?" The color drained from her face. She recognized the papers instantly. They were files she thought were hidden in her private office. And then came the real blow. David held up his phone. A recording filled the room with Victoria's unmistakable voice. "I don't care if your daughter is in the hospital, David. People like you always have excuses. Either do the job properly or go back where you belong." The silence that followed was crushing. What David revealed that day was only the beginning. The documents in his briefcase were just the first move in a carefully calculated plan, one that would turn the city's most powerful woman into a cautionary tale about the danger of underestimating the people you cast aside. And if you want to hear how David's plan unfolds, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment. Because trust me, the next chapter will leave you speechless. Cameras zoomed in on Victoria's face, now completely drained of color. Journalists began whispering, fingers flying across their keyboards as headlines practically wrote themselves. "That was taken out of context," she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of the silence in the room. David didn't flinch. His calmness only made her look more desperate. "Context?" he said evenly. "Let's provide some then." He pulled out a folder and began leafing through the papers with deliberate precision. "Here are the medical records of my daughter, Sophie, age 8, admitted to the hospital on December 15th at 2:37 a.m. with a severe asthma attack." He held the documents up so every camera could catch the proof. "And here," he continued, displaying his phone, "are the messages I sent to you that morning, begging for just 15 minutes so I could make sure my daughter was breathing before I came to drive your car." Victoria's hand twitched at her pearl necklace. Her empire was built on the image of compassion, but now that facade was cracking wide open. What she never cared to learn was who David Thompson truly was. a magna cum laude graduate from Howard University, a man who had put aside a bright career in business after his wife's tragic accident left him raising Sophie alone while caring for his ill mother. Becoming a chauffeur wasn't humiliation. It was a strategy. David knew powerful people often spoke freely in front of those they considered invisible. For 4 years, he had listened, memorized, and quietly filed away every whispered scheme, every careless confession in the back seat of her luxury car. "Ms. Ashford," David said, his voice calm but cutting, "do you also remember forcing me to work 17 hours straight on my daughter's birthday? Because, as you said, emergencies don't respect sentimental dates?" Victoria tried to stand, but her legs trembled beneath her. I never said it exactly like that," she protested weakly. David's lips curved into a cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Then perhaps I should refresh your memory with a few more recordings." The CNN reporter seized the moment. "Mr. Thompson, how did you gather all this evidence?" David turned toward her with the quiet authority of someone teaching a lesson. "When you're treated like furniture for 4 years, people forget that furniture has eyes, ears, and sometimes a photographic memory." That was when Victoria snapped. Desperation stripped away her carefully curated image. "You're believing the word of a driver?" she burst out. "I built an empire. I donate millions, and you—" The words died in the air. Every person in the room had just seen her mask fall completely away. David only nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed what he already knew. "And it is precisely that mentality, Ms. Ashford, that brought you here today." He turned to the cameras, and for the first time, the intelligence in his eyes was undeniable. "For 4 years, I served a woman who paraded herself as a philanthropist while forcing employees to sleep in cars during snowstorms. A woman who donated millions for publicity while denying 15 minutes of compassion to a father fighting for his daughter's life." Victoria's voice wavered as she played her last card. "David, we can settle this quietly. I can offer you generous compensation." David let out a humorless laugh. "Compensation? Ms. Ashford, you still don't understand. This was never about money." He locked eyes with her, and a chill ran down her spine. She recognized the look, calculated, ruthless, the same look she had used to dominate boardrooms. But here, it was turned against her. "Every night I spent in my car after you cast me out. Every meal my daughter missed because I couldn't afford both food and medicine. Every tear my mother shed, believing she had raised a failure. All of it gave me time to plan this moment." Around the ballroom, investors shifted uncomfortably. Some were already sending urgent texts to their attorneys. Victoria's reputation, and theirs by association, was collapsing in real time. But what terrified her most was that David hadn't revealed even half of what he carried in that black briefcase. His calm smile was not the smile of revenge. It was the expression of a man executing a strategy planned with surgical precision down to the very second. For 4 years, she had underestimated him. Now she realized, too late, that she had created the very storm now consuming her. David Thompson had turned every humiliation into fuel, every injustice into evidence, every sleepless night into preparation. And this was only the beginning. And Victoria, with all her privilege and arrogance, was finally beginning to realize the truth. She hadn't underestimated an employee. She had underestimated an adversary who had been playing chess while she thought she was still playing checkers. She forced a smile for the cameras, but behind her eyes her mind raced. Investors, journalists, the press, it was all slipping away. What she didn't understand was that this wasn't chance. This moment had been engineered with the precision of a military operation. 3 weeks earlier, on the night David Thompson was left out in the snow, he hadn't simply accepted defeat. Shivering on a park bench while his daughter slept in the back seat of their car, he made the decision that would change everything. "Daddy, why can't we go home?" Sophie whispered, her small voice muffled under the blanket. "Because sometimes, sweetheart," David replied softly, "powerful people think they can step on those they believe are beneath them. But they forget, those they underestimate can be the most dangerous. What Victoria never realized was that David had been preparing for this for years. For 2 long years, he had quietly documented every questionable conversation, every backseat phone call, every careless remark she had made in that BMW. His photographic memory wasn't just for numbers. He remembered dates, names, deals, every thread of her tangled empire. The day after his eviction, David reached out to someone he had only heard about, Rachel Morrison, a CNN investigative journalist known for chasing stories no one else dared to touch. At first, Rachel was skeptical when David asked to meet, but in that dim cafe in Brooklyn, when he began reciting word-for-word conversations between Victoria and city officials, complete with dates, amounts, and locations, her skepticism turned into sharp focus. "Can you prove this?" Rachel had asked, leaning across the table. David's lips curved into a thin smile for the first time in weeks. "Not only can I prove it, I have recordings. I have photos of documents she left in the back seat, and I have a memory that stored every detail she thought her invisible driver would never notice." Rachel nearly spilled her coffee. "You recorded her for 4 years." "Not everything," David replied calmly. "Only the parts involving bribed inspectors, fixed contracts, and those interesting comments she made about keeping people in their place." He slid a folder across the table. "This is just the beginning." For the next 3 weeks, David and Rachel worked side by side like detectives. Every lead was cross-checked, every date confirmed, every deal matched against public records. What they uncovered was staggering: an empire built on corruption, rigged bids, and a kind of arrogance so deep that Victoria had practically documented her own crimes. "David, this isn't just about you being thrown aside," Rachel said one night as they pieced together timelines. "You've got enough here to bring down not just her, but 6 officials and business leaders with her." But David's plan wasn't just about exposure. He wanted it to happen in the one place she felt untouchable, on stage, in front of her allies, under the glare of cameras. "She'll dismiss me as just a driver," David predicted. "That arrogance will be her undoing." Rachel smiled knowingly. "And when she does, that's when we reveal who you really are." Now, in the grand ballroom of the Ritz, Victoria made the very mistake David had anticipated. "You're really going to believe the word of a driver?" she scoffed, her contempt echoing across the silent room. David nodded slowly, as though she had just sprung the trap herself. "Thank you, Ms. Ashford, because now I can introduce someone far more credible than a mere driver." From the audience, Rachel Morrison rose to her feet, her CNN press badge catching the light. "Ms. Ashford," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "our team has independently verified every one of Mr. Thompson's claims. Would you like to comment on the fraudulent housing contracts we've uncovered? Or should we start with the bribes paid to City Inspector Johnson?" Victoria's face drained of color. The name alone was enough. Johnson was her most valuable contact in City Hall, the man who fast-tracked her projects in exchange for generous consulting fees. And now his name had just been spoken into every microphone in the room. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria stammered, but her voice was weak, unconvincing. David didn't blink. He calmly pulled out another sheet from his folder and raised it for the cameras. "Ms. Ashford, do you remember this phone call on March 17th of last year? You said—" His voice rang through the ballroom. "Johnson, the housing project must be approved this week. You know your son needs that scholarship my foundation provides, don't you?" The silence was suffocating. Several investors shifted in their seats. A few quietly rose, moving toward the exit, already distancing themselves from the scandal unraveling before their eyes. But David wasn't done. He looked straight at Victoria, and for the first time, she no longer saw the obedient chauffeur she had dismissed for 4 years. She saw something else, a man who had turned every insult into fuel, every injustice into evidence, every forced silence into an opportunity to collect proof. The most interesting thing, Miss Ashford, David continued evenly, is that during all those years, you never once asked me about my education. You never wondered why someone with a magna cum laude degree in business from Howard University would choose to drive a car. If you had, you might have discovered that people with photographic memories and training in systems analysis are particularly skilled at identifying patterns and building airtight cases. The color drained from her face. She finally understood. This wasn't an angry employee lashing out. This was a strategist, a man who had spent 4 years documenting her every move while she treated him as invisible. Rachel Morrison stepped up to the microphone, her CNN badge catching the lights. "This," she announced, "is only the first chapter of our investigation. Over the next week, we will be releasing documents proving a pattern of rigged contracts, manipulated bids, and systemic discrimination inside Victoria Ashford's companies." That was when Victoria snapped. She shoved back her chair and tried to storm toward the exit. "Ms. Ashford," David's voice cut through the room like a blade, "where are you going? We haven't even gotten to the undeclared funds in your Cayman accounts yet." Victoria froze mid-step. That was her deepest secret, known only to her personal accountant. And then she remembered, with horror, the countless phone calls she had made from the backseat of her BMW, with David sitting just a few feet away. For 4 years, she had treated her driver like furniture. And now, she realized that every word, every careless document, every whispered plan had been preserved by a mind that forgot nothing. Her voice trembled. I don't know what you mean." David smiled, the first genuine smile of satisfaction that day. "You don't know? Then perhaps you should hear this recording from August 23rd. You instructed your accountant to transfer $2.7 million to an offshore account. I could read the account number aloud, but I'm sure you remember it." Gasps rippled across the ballroom. The panic in Victoria's eyes was visible from across the room. She leaned closer to him, whispering desperately, "What do you want? Money? I can transfer any amount right now, today." David let out a humorless laugh. "Money? For 4 years you paid me $42,000 a year to drive your car while you hid millions overseas. Do you really believe this is about money?" Rachel Morrison approached with a tablet in hand. "Ms. Ashford, our investigation also uncovered something about the Fifth Avenue housing project, the same project where 17 families were pushed out using fraudulent paperwork." Victoria's lips parted to deny it, but David lifted yet another document. "Perhaps you've forgotten this recording, Ms. Ashford. You told your lawyer, and I quote, 'These people won't read the fine print. Use the most complicated language possible, and they'll sign anything.'" The entire hall fell silent. Journalists typed furiously. Investors slipped away. And Victoria Ashford, once untouchable, stood cornered, exposed, and utterly alone. The room was frozen in silence. Cameras zoomed in on every drop of sweat sliding down Victoria's face, every tremor in her manicured hands. The few investors who hadn't already fled stared at her with a mix of horror and disgust. "David, please," she begged, her voice cracking. The arrogance that once defined her was gone. "We can talk privately. I can make this right. I'll make it up to you." David turned away from her and addressed the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, for 4 years, this woman treated me like furniture. She never asked my name. She never knew I had a daughter. She didn't care when I slept in my car because my mother's medical bills left me with nothing. And yet she calls herself a philanthropist." He flipped another page from his folder and pressed a button on his phone. Victoria's voice suddenly echoed through the ballroom. "These people need to learn they can't just demand equality. They have to earn the right to stand in the same spaces as us." The silence that followed was suffocating. Several audience members rose and walked out, visibly disgusted. Camera flashes captured Victoria's face as sheer panic overtook her composure. That was taken out of context," she cried, her voice high-pitched and desperate. David shook his head slowly. "Context, Ms. Ashford? That recording was from a conversation with your sister about why you fired 3 employees in the same week. Would you like me to play the rest?" Before she could answer, her phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then again. Messages poured in nonstop. She glanced at the screen, her face draining of color. "My God," she whispered, staring at the texts. "The investors, they're canceling everything." Rachel Morrison stepped forward to the microphone. For those watching, this press conference is being broadcast live on CNN. So far, more than 2 million people are tuned in. Victoria turned back to David, tears welling in her eyes. "You've destroyed my entire life. 30 years. I built this empire with my own hands." David's gaze was steady, almost calm. "Ms. Ashford, I haven't destroyed anything. You did that yourself, word by word, call by call, deal by deal. I just documented it." At that moment, 2 men in dark suits entered the room. "Mrs. Ashford," one of them said firmly, "we're with the Internal Revenue Service. We need to speak with you about certain irregularities in your tax records." Victoria spun, desperate, searching for an ally. But the remaining investors only glared back at her with the same contempt she had shown David for years. "How?" she whispered hoarsely, looking back at him. "How did you gather all this?" David closed his briefcase, stood tall, and for the first time in 4 years, he looked down on her, not in height, but in dignity. "Because, Ms. Ashford, you never cared enough to ask who I was. You never wondered why someone with my qualifications would take this job. If you had, you would have learned that people trained in business and blessed with a photographic memory are very good at recognizing criminal patterns and building airtight cases against those who think they're untouchable." The wail of sirens grew louder outside the hotel. Victoria turned to the window in disbelief as police cars pulled up to the entrance. "David," she whispered desperately, her voice trembling. "Please, I can change. I can be better. Just please." David regarded her with a calm mixture of pity and resolve. "Ms. Ashford, you had 4 years to choose a different path. 4 years to treat people with dignity. You didn't. And now, this is where those choices have led." He turned toward the cameras. "True justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure innocent people never suffer at the hands of those who abuse their power." Seconds later, federal agents approached Victoria and placed her under arrest. Cameras flashed as the woman who had built an empire was led away in handcuffs, her head bowed, her legacy shattered. For 4 years, she had treated David as if he were invisible. And now, ironically, she was the one who would vanish from the very society she had once ruled, while he emerged as a symbol of quiet strength and unshakable strategy. But as Victoria's empire crumbled in a single afternoon, one question lingered. Was the fall of one tyrant enough to heal the wounds of those who had suffered in silence? Or was there a deeper lesson about justice, dignity, and redemption waiting to be uncovered? 6 months later, David Thompson sat in a sleek office on the 23rd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. Sunlight spilled through the glass as he looked out over the city. On his desk was a photo of Sophie smiling, finally healthy, next to her grandmother. For the first time in years, peace had returned to his life, and somewhere in a prison cell, Victoria Ashford was finally learning what it felt like to be invisible. As executive director of the Social Justice Foundation, a nonprofit he created using the proceeds from the rights to his story, David had transformed his ordeal into a platform for change. What began as one man's fight for dignity had become hope for hundreds of exploited workers who finally found their voice. Victoria Ashford, meanwhile, was serving a 5-year sentence for fraud and corruption. Her assets were seized, her contracts canceled, her reputation erased. The woman who once saw David as invisible was now reduced to nothing more than a number in the prison system. At dinner one evening in their new apartment, Sophie looked up from her plate. David smiled gently and pulled his daughter into a hug. "Princess, I didn't destroy Victoria Ashford. I only showed the world who she truly was behind the mask." Real justice was never about humiliating her. It was about proving that we can build something better. His foundation had already helped more than 200 workers escape abusive employers, always guided by the principle he had carved out of his own suffering. The best revenge is the success your enemies never believed you were capable of. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments, because at the end of the day, no matter how powerful those who try to break you may seem, true strength lies in turning injustice into the fuel that builds something greater.